Berlin, 1938. High-ranking officials of the Reich Ministry of Aviation stared at technical drawings and their faces turned pale with horror. What they saw contradicted all laws of physics and any logic. An aircraft whose cockpit did not sit in the centre, but was completely displaced to the right side while the engine reigned on the left. An asymmetric monstrosity that, according to the opinion of all experts, could never take off from the ground. The officials shouted that this machine would lead the pilot to certain doom, but the designer stood before them with a face of stone and iron conviction. This man had a plan that was meant to revolutionise all of aviation, and the impossible actually happened. The aircraft not only flew, it flew brilliantly. So brilliantly that the military immediately ordered 500 units, a triumph that was supposed to dominate German reconnaissance. But then a chain of catastrophes began that no one could foresee. The glazed cabin became a death trap. Technical problems accumulated like avalanches, and finally something occurred that not only buried this project, but catapulted the designer himself into a completely unexpected future. In the end, of 500 machines ordered, exactly 0 were deployed in combat. How could a celebrated breakthrough become perhaps the most absurd failure in aviation history? The answer is more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. Berlin, 1938. The heavy oak doors of the Reich Ministry of Aviation closed behind a group of high-ranking officials who had gathered around a massive conference table. On the polished surface lay spread technical drawings, and what these men beheld there made their faces blanch with terror. The construction plans lying before them contradicted every principle of aeronautical engineering and all logic they had learned during their decades-long careers. The cockpit of this aircraft was not located centrally in the fuselage, as was the case with all normal machines, but was completely shifted to the right side. The engine, on the other hand, sat on the left side, creating an absolutely asymmetric construction that went against everything believed about aerodynamic stability. One of the officials grabbed his head and cried out that this thing could never lift off the ground, that it would immediately flip over and lead the pilot to certain destruction. His colleagues nodded in agreement, completely convinced that they were looking at the sketches of a madman. Yet the creator of these plans stood before them with petrified features, and in his eyes burned an unshakable certainty. Richard Vogt, a 40-year-old aircraft designer, had survived the trenches of the First World War, had flown in fragile biplanes over battlefields, and such bureaucratic objections could no longer shake him. In aviation circles, Vogt was known as an uncompromising innovator, as a man who never walked beaten paths and always sought revolutionary solutions where others saw only traditional approaches. The story of this incredible aircraft had begun several months earlier when the Reich Ministry of Aviation announced a competition for the development of a new single-engine reconnaissance aircraft. The requirements had been formulated precisely and without compromise. The machine was to accommodate a 3-person crew, offer excellent all-round visibility for observation of enemy territory, while remaining fast and manoeuvrable. The ministry expressly emphasised that the aircraft must be single-engine in order to simplify production and reduce fuel consumption. Leading German aviation companies were invited to participate in the competition: Arado, Focke-Wulf, and several other established manufacturers. The company Blohm and Voss, where Vogt worked, did not even receive an invitation. The reason was obvious. The enterprise had specialised in seaplanes and flying boats, not in land-based reconnaissance aircraft. But Richard Vogt did not belong to those people who sit quietly on the sidelines when the opportunity arises to create something truly revolutionary. Vogt had long reflected on the fundamental problems of aircraft construction. All aircraft of that era were built according to the same symmetric scheme. Engine at the front in the centre, cockpit behind it, wings positioned in the middle, tail assembly at the rear. This scheme seemed logical and natural, but Vogt recognised numerous weaknesses in it. First, pilots and observers sat behind a massive engine that blocked their view forward and upward. Second, the rotating propeller generated powerful air currents that struck against the rudders and destabilised flight. Third, and this was particularly interesting, the torque from the engine constantly pulled the machine to one side, forcing the pilot to permanently make course corrections. It turned out that symmetric aircraft actually flew asymmetrically, and pilots had to fight against their machines instead of these obediently executing their commands. Vogt posed himself a provocative question. What if one constructed an aircraft that would be asymmetric in design but symmetric in its flight characteristics? What would happen if one deliberately offset the components so as to compensate for all those imbalances and inconveniences with which conventional designs had to struggle? This consideration led him to a concept that was meant to turn the entire aviation industry upside down. But before he could realize his vision, he needed someone willing to bet on this apparent gamble. And precisely such a person was found in Walter Blohm, the owner of the company Blohm & Voss, who was among the few who did not consider Vogt's idea pure madness. Blohm was a far-sighted entrepreneur who firmly believed that the future of aviation after the war would belong to civilian transport, while military contracts represented only a temporary source of income. He dreamed that the seaplanes of his company would one day replace ferries and passenger ships, would transport people between continents and countries across the oceans. Therefore, Blohm always encouraged innovations and unconventional solutions that could distinguish his aircraft from the competition. When Vogt came to him with the drawings of the asymmetric reconnaissance aircraft, Blohm saw in it not only military potential, but the possibility of making his company famous worldwide. He gave approval for development, although the Ministry of Aviation had not even invited them to participate in the competition. Vogt and his team of engineers threw themselves into the work with tremendous enthusiasm. The designer decided to place the BMW 132 engine on the left side in a separate fuselage that extended to the tail assembly. On the right side was located a completely glazed gondola made of plexiglass, in which the three-person crew was housed: the pilot at the front, the observer in the centre, and the gunner with a machine gun at the rear. This gondola was attached to the wing and provided absolutely fantastic, all-round visibility in all directions. The crew members could see the ground beneath them, the sky above their heads, the space to the sides, and even backward without any obstruction. No other single-engine aircraft could boast such quality of visibility. The wing connected both parts of the construction and had been specially calculated so that the distribution of a lift force compensated for the asymmetric weight distribution. Vogt performed extremely complex mathematical calculations, thereby proving that the aircraft would remain stable in flight. The first prototype was completed at the end of 1938. When the mechanics rolled the machine onto the airfield, all those present froze. The aircraft looked as if it had been assembled from parts of two different machines. The test pilot, who had the task of getting this construction into the air, walked around the aircraft for a long time, shook his head, and muttered something to himself. He did not believe that this thing could fly normally. The ground crew was also nervous. Many placed bets that the aircraft would either not take off from the ground or would immediately tip over on its side after takeoff. Vogt stood aside with clenched fists but externally maintained his composure. He knew that if the first flight failed, his career would be destroyed and the idea of asymmetric aircraft would be buried forever. The engine roared, the propeller began to spin, and the aircraft picked up speed on the runway. Speed increased, the construction vibrated and rumbled but held course. Then the nose lifted and the machine detached from the ground. For several seconds all observers held their breath expecting catastrophe, but the aircraft continued to gain altitude smoothly and confidently, as if mocking all the skeptics. The pilot made a circle above the aerodrome, performed several manoeuvres, and landed safely. Climbing out of the cockpit, he was pale and shaken, but his first words were, "This machine flies better than many conventional aircraft." There were no problems with roll, the control was precise and predictable, and the view from the glass gondola truly surpassed everything he had experienced before, but Vogt already saw in the distance dark clouds forming that were meant to threaten his project. For in the higher circles of the Luftwaffe there were men who approached the asymmetric marvel with the deepest skepticism, and one of them had the power to bury the entire undertaking with a single word. The news of the successful maiden flight spread at lightning speed through German aviation circles. One of those who showed particular interest in the unusual machine was General Colonel of the Luftwaffe Ernst Udet, a living legend from the First World War and one of Hermann Göring's closest collaborators. Udet was not an ordinary bureaucrat but a genuine aviator who understood aviation and knew how to appreciate bold technical solutions. When he was presented with the test results of the BV-141, as the new aircraft was now called, he immediately demanded a personal demonstration. Vogt agreed with pleasure, for he recognised in Udet a potential ally in the highest ranks of military leadership. Udet flew to the airfield, examined the aircraft thoroughly, asked numerous technical questions, and even boarded himself as an observer. After the flight, the general showed enthusiasm. He declared that this aircraft practically fulfilled all the ministry's requirements and even exceeded them in some parameters. Udet promised Vogt his support and began to advance the project in the highest spheres of power. The asymmetric construction had thus found a powerful advocate, but simultaneously resistance was forming from a direction that no one could ignore. Hermann Göring, Supreme Commander of the Luftwaffe and one of the most influential men in the Third Reich, regarded the asymmetric aircraft with deep mistrust. Göring was a conservative in matters of aviation technology, who preferred proven traditional designs to experimental novelties. When he was told about the BV-141, he called the project a circus trick and expressed doubts that such a machine could ever be put into service. His open support went to Vogt's competitors, especially the company Focke-Wulf, which had presented for the competition their reconnaissance aircraft FW-189 with the nickname Uhu, which means owl. This aircraft possessed a classic twin-boom configuration with 2 engines and a completely glazed central gondola. Formerly, the FW-189 violated the ministry requirement for a single-engine construction, but Göring turned a blind eye to this, considering the twin-engine aircraft more reliable and safer. The company Arado also did not remain idle. They developed their own variant of a reconnaissance aircraft under the designation R-198, which the Ministry of Aviation originally wanted to put into service without any competition. The officials had practically already promised Arado the contract, but when the prototype was finally built and tested, it turned out that the machine was frankly unsuccessful. The aircraft showed poor flight characteristics, proved unstable in the air, and did not meet the required specifications. After several test flights, the Project R-198 was definitively abandoned, and all the officials' hopes shifted to Focke-Wulf. This gave Vogt and his creation a chance, but only on the condition that they could prove the superiority of the asymmetric construction over the traditional twin-engine owl. On the 4th of April 1940, official comparative tests took place between the BV-141 and the FW-189. A commission from the Ministry of Aviation arrived at the test site to see with their own eyes the capabilities of both machines. The trials included speed measurements, maneuverability, stability, cockpit visibility quality, and the ability to conduct reconnaissance from various altitudes. Both aircraft delivered good results, but the BV-141 possessed several decisive advantages. Its single-engine construction made the machine simpler to maintain and cheaper to produce. The view from the completely glazed gondola proved even better than that of the FW-189, thanks to greater glazed area and the absence of obstructing structural elements. Moreover, Vogt's asymmetric aircraft demonstrated excellent controllability and stability, completely refuting the concerns of the skeptics. In their final report, the Commission wrote that the BV-141 fulfilled almost all mission requirements and showed great potential as a reconnaissance machine. Udet used these results and began actively to lobby the project in the ministry. He convinced the officials that the asymmetric aircraft was precisely what the Luftwaffe needed for effective reconnaissance on all fronts. Despite Göring's resistance, who continued to insist on the FW-189, the Ministry of Aviation made in 1939 a decision that shocked the entire aviation industry. An order was placed for 500 aircraft of the BV-141. This was a triumph for Vogt, for Blom, and for the entire development team. Their creation, which just recently had been called madness, was now to become the mass reconnaissance aircraft of the Luftwaffe. In the plans of the military command, the BV-141 was to be used on all theatres of war, but particular hopes were placed on the Eastern Front, where a large-scale invasion of the Soviet Union was being prepared. Vogt's team jubilated. Engineers embraced each other, mechanics opened champagne bottles, and the designer himself finally allowed himself to smile. Years of hard work, struggle against bureaucracy and skepticism had fully paid off. The company Blom and Voss received an enormous contract that was meant to secure work for years to come. Preparations for mass production began immediately. New factory halls were built, equipment was purchased, additional workers were hired. The designers were already working on an improved version of the aircraft with more powerful engines and reinforced armament. It seemed that a brilliant future awaited the asymmetric reconnaissance aircraft, and it would become one of the symbols of German aviation. Military planning staffs were already developing tactics for the employment of the new machines, training pilots and observers, drafting plans for reconnaissance operations deep in enemy territory. The use of the BV-141 for reconnaissance of Soviet fortifications, airfields and troop concentrations before the beginning of Operation Barbarossa was discussed particularly intensively. But the euphoria did not last long. The deeper the engineers delved into the preparation of serial production and built new prototypes, the more serious problems emerged that had previously either been overlooked or considered insignificant. The first and most dangerous problem concerned the crew, precisely that completely glazed gondola that provided excellent all-round visibility and was considered the main advantage of the BV-141 proved to be a death trap under combat conditions. Glass, even armoured, could not protect the pilot, observer and gunner from bullets and shrapnel. Any enemy fighter or any anti-aircraft installation could turn the transparent cabin into a sieve within seconds. The crew members were in fact sitting in an aquarium completely exposed to enemy fire. Military aviators who were supposed to fly these machines began to express serious concerns regarding their safety. Several pilots declared openly that they did not want to take off in an aircraft where they would be visible to the enemy as if on a silver platter and at the same time practically defenceless. But this was only the beginning of a cascade of technical catastrophes that were meant to call the entire project into question. The second problem was of purely technical nature and revealed itself increasingly clearly during longer test flights. The rudder located on the tail assembly constantly experienced excessive aerodynamic drag. The air currents from the propeller and from the asymmetric fuselage generated turbulence that struck against the rudder and complicated control. Pilots had to exert additional efforts to maintain course, particularly at higher speeds. This was not critical for short test flights, but during multi-hour reconnaissance missions, as they were envisioned for front deployment, the permanent struggle with the rudders considerably exhausted the pilot and reduced the effectiveness of the entire crew. The engineers attempted to solve the problem by changing the shape and surface area of the rudders, but each modification brought new difficulties with weight distribution. The third problem arose when machine guns and additional equipment began to be installed. The weight of the machine increased, and it turned out that the wing was not long enough to maintain proper balance. The right side with the heavy gondola and armament began to outweigh the left side with the engine. It became necessary to lengthen the wing, which in turn increased the overall weight of the construction and reduced speed. Each correction of one problem created two new ones, and the engineers became entangled in an endless cycle of improvements and modifications. Vogt was desperate. He realised that his creation, which had performed so brilliantly in the first tests, was transforming into a capricious and problematic machine requiring constant compromises. Nevertheless, the work continued. By 1941, 3 full-fledged prototypes were manufactured for in-depth testing, as well as a batch of 5 machines of version A for evaluation trials with the troops. These aircraft were equipped with BMW 132 engines that enabled a maximum speed of approximately 438 km per hour. The range was approximately 1,900 km, and the service ceiling reached 9,700 metres. The performance characteristics were quite respectable for a reconnaissance aircraft, but the military wanted more.